Adventures in Supply Chain podcast is pleased to announce the Coronavirus and Supply Chain series to help our communities with the insights of outstanding leaders in supply chain and in other critical functions. These challenging times are also for transformations and opportunities. We will get through this together, and we will make it happen. It's our pleasure to introduce Dr. Kenneth Boyer, Faculty Director, Non-Degree Executive Education at The Ohio State University, Fisher College of Business. Prior to this position, Dr. Boyer was Chair of the Management Science Department. The mission of the department is to provide world-class research, teaching, and outreach in all areas of operations, purchasing, and supply chain management. Other previous positions of Dr. Boyer include Dean's Distinguished Professor at The Ohio State University for 10 years and Faculty Director, working Professional MBA Program. Dr. Boyer was also Professor at Michigan State University for 8 years. And now with you, your host, Marcia, and her amazing guest, Dr. Kenneth Boyer.
Welcome, Ken. It's a pleasure to have you on the show. I'm sure your insight will be very helpful to the audience. So welcome.
Thank you for having me, Marcia. It's a pleasure.
Of course. And we are going to start with the first question, that is, you as a supply chain leader that have worked with many companies, you have done research in many industries, companies. What are the companies that will become stronger out of this pandemic situation? And what are the reasons? If you could please elaborate on that.
Right. Well, so obviously we all pray that healthcare will become stronger. I've done a little bit of work in operational excellence and a fair amount of work in healthcare, and I can't say that I thought of this ahead of time, but healthcare in the US definitely needs to get better. It needs to have extra capacity, needs to have some supply chain resiliency. So healthcare, one, needs to change, and I think it's gonna have to change. Second, highly wired knowledge economy companies. So there's been talk of the big four, Apple, Google, Facebook.
Yes.
Becoming even more a part of our lives, which is, they're great, but there's some privacy concerns. I read an example this morning. There's a company called Teladoc Health that does telemedicine. Clearly, we have opportunities to use telemedicine. Their stock is up 50%. And one of the interesting things is, in the US, there's been a lot of debate about the effects of Obamacare 10 years on.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not sure a lot of people realize one of the things that Obamacare did was it put $20 billion into incentives for hospitals to adopt healthcare information technology. And so hospitals did that largely between about 2010 and 2015. Were it not for that, we couldn't do telehealth now. So I think that's we're fortunate. Distribution companies are going to have to change in many different ways. Amazon and a lot of far-flung companies are doing great now, but it might happen that we go to more local supply chains, because one of the things this is exposed is there's some critical things like masks, PPE equipment, ventilators, that if they're produced in another country and you don't have access to them in the United States or France or Spain or Italy, you have a major problem.
Yes.
And then last, I'll close this question with a quick, fun example. Ravensburger is a company I read about. They make custom jigsaw puzzles, and yet they're growing like crazy because people are bored and they want to be able to do something. They still make every die to cut jigsaws by hand.
Wow.
And it's interesting. I don't know if you've ever thought about it, but it would be a real problem if your 1,000-piece jigsaw puzzle had the piece in the wrong place. So they have to be unique.
Yes. Ah. Yes, yes. And Ken, you are absolutely right when you talk about healthcare. This is in relation to the second question that I prepared. What are the issues that this coronavirus has exposed, right? Because you mentioned also some of the reasons, capacity. Now we are having very complex supply chains all around the globe. So then one of the pieces of that supply chain is not working. Then we go through material shortages. And also another point that you were mentioning is technology, that for healthcare, there's some concern about data security. And you are exactly right also when you talk about those issues. Zoom has that too, right? They were not prepared for this. So coming back to the second question, what are the issues that this pandemic is showing us about supply chain?
Well, it's showing that business as usual doesn't work in pandemic times. So one of my thoughts is that we've pushed operational excellence and lean inventory a little bit too far. It works great for business as usual, and it works great for the vast majority of companies and organizations, but we haven't invested enough in supply chain resilience. So I've got a colleague who teaches at the University of Iowa who does research in supply chain resilience. Her name is Jen Blackhurst. I think the importance of her research is going to really explode. Second thing is material shortages from the relatively banal toilet paper.
Oh, yes.
There's been a run on toilet paper, and there's a lot of theories as to why. But I saw an interesting article. One of the arguments why there's a run on toilet paper is there are really two markets for toilet paper. There's the professional business sector when we're all at work, and there's the at home. And there is enough toilet paper out there, but it's at all the large companies, the JP Morgan Chases, the Nationwide Insurances, the General Electrics. We're all working from home, so now we need the toilet paper at home instead of work. So I saw a figure that home toilet paper, personal toilet paper, has gone up by 50%. That's a relatively banal example, but then we also see all the concerns about PPE equipment, masks, ventilators, cleaning supplies, okay? A lot of that stuff is necessary and critical to human life. We've heard some great stories of General Motors and other companies like 3M scaling up and redeploying their supply chains to make PPE equipment. And then I'll close with one quick example. I am currently doing some work with one of the 4 or 5 major retailers in the US, not Amazon. They have closed all their stores. They're doing a huge business out of their distribution center, but there are challenges there too. Last week, they had to shut a 2 million square foot distribution center because somebody had COVID, and they had to pay Service Master to come in and clean every surface in the distribution center.
Wow.
I can only imagine how big that bill was.
Yes, yes. So not only the material shortages, but also the staff to keep running the plants. Yes. Yes, and that is one of the key challenges that, for example, the manufacturers of ventilators are facing. How to keep the plant running because of the health issue.
If you're an employee in a ventilator or a mask company, even if you're doing this for the first time, you're just like a healthcare worker. You're on the front lines. You're doing something that's helping the healthcare workers out.
Yes, yes, exactly. And then, Ken, you mentioned a little bit about this, but what is the role that technology, data analysis, and predictive analytics have in this?
I think couple words: scientific prowess, test, test, test. So in terms of data analytics, the visualizations that are coming out of this COVID are amazing to help track the data. the science, there's a lot of, and I apologize for this term, I think fairly basic science. I have several scientist friends in the research community. The ability to test for the virus, but we've neglected that in much of the world. Again, that goes with supply chain resiliency. I think what will come out of this, hopefully, is governments and leaders saying, hey, we have to stockpile some resources so that when there's a virus, we can test quicker, we can mobilize the lab scientists that understand epidemiology and these critical issues.
Yes, yes, exactly. And what are your recommendations for leaders on priorities? What should be their focus, at least right now? And I think you covered this talking about supply chain resilience. So that has changed. Many times in my role, what I do is to achieve cost reduction. That is not so important in this moment, right? We need to have the materials to keep running, and then so the company can generate a revenue. So what are your thoughts about priorities?
I think leaders, and I'm going to focus more on supply chain because that's kind of your core area of expertise in mine. In the private sector, there's been a movement, at least in the developed world over the last 2 to 5 decades, where companies have said that they're for profit only. And I think they've neglected a little bit both their customers and their employees. And in the private sector, what I would hope would come out of this is a better recognition that you have to protect your employees in your business. So, for example, Amazon is doing record-breaking business for them, and they're simultaneously trying to hire workers, but then they also have workers threatening to strike because they're at risk going into a distribution center. They're at risk delivering to somebody's household. And I think it's a challenge, because you can argue that a distribution worker right now is critical to the economy. And yet, if you're not getting paid a lot, it's normal to be worried about your health. In academia, where I come from, and you and I know each other from the Broad Michigan State MBA program, I think we need to re-examine a couple things. We need to focus more on supply chain resiliency. We have to talk about critical thinking, because it's not just book knowledge, it's the ability to combine from several different areas. So epidemiology with supply chain, with leadership. Life really occurs at the intersection of multiple ideas. And so it'll be very interesting to see what happens in both the private sector and in higher education and primary education over the next 5 to 10 years.
Yes, we know that it's going to be different, right? Now we are going to have a new world after this crisis.
Mm-hmm.
Now we are changing, right? For example, now we are using technology to have this meeting that maybe before we had it in person.
Right, so thank God, or thank Zoom or whatever.
Yes, so we are connecting. And what do you think about the content of the work for supply chain professionals? Will that have a change based on this situation? A change, for example, in the metrics, in the performance metrics? What are your thoughts?
I like how you asked that question, because nobody knows, but you mentioned performance metrics. I'll go back to my previous point. I think my sense is we've fallen too much on the workers must do more, we must be more productive, and so on. I think productivity is critically important, but so is safety and the health of workers. So in supervisory work in the private sector, I think there's gonna hopefully be more sensitivity to the needs of workers, that you can't deliver definitely tangible products without a human workforce. And the human workforce has to be healthy in order to be able to do that. Now, white collar work, so-called knowledge workers, one of the things this virus is exposed is for knowledge work, a lot of it can be done virtually. And I think it really is amazing what we can do from our homes or from wherever we are. But then the final thing I'm going to say, supply chain, I think clearly there's going to be some rebalancing, some reshoring, and some localization of supply chains.
Mhm.
I think it's amazing how global the world is, but there's certain things that look at the local food movement. So look how many people have tried to eat local and so on. It's still a very small percentage of the food, but it makes sense to say, what are our strategic things where we ought to have a more localized supply chain so that an individual country, state, or city doesn't have to depend on something across the world.
Yes. Yes, and we need to work on that right now because, for example, when this started in China, that honestly I never thought that would get here. I thought it was something from China. Some of the companies were having issues, right, because they weren't able to produce like before. And then some wanted to switch to different suppliers, right, to find different sources. And was very challenging. Like they didn't have enough time. And then the pandemic hit New York and the US. So the moment is now to find those alternative sources that can be, in many cases, it can be domestically sourcing to ensure that the supply chain will continue running, at least for the critical parts. I think like the key is also to do like process mapping with the supply chain. I know and know all the key partners that sometimes we don't know.
Right, and I think to your point, the world's been moving so fast that a lot of people didn't stop and think, well, what happens if I can't get obviously a ventilator within a certain amount of time, or a mask, or right now, my wife and I have a cistern in our house and it's built in. I have an electronic water sensor. It broke and I sent it off to New Zealand on February 12th. Now I can't get it back. So I have no way to measure my water other than to open a big manhole and shine a flashlight in, which is difficult.
Yeah.
So I think people will have to sort of be a little bit more conscious about thinking, what's a nice to have versus what's a fairly important or must have.
Yes, exactly right. Exactly right. So I would like to thank you very much for all the time explanations. It was so nice to have you because I remember my time at Michigan State and you were my professor in operations. I learned many aspects and tools. It was a great course that I still apply, and to me it's an honor to have you in the show. And I'm sure the audience is very pleased with all your contributions because you are helping us, you are sharing your knowledge, and you are taking part of your time to help us to get through this. So thank you so much.
Well, thank you for having me, Marcia. I hope your family and everybody is healthy. And as we close, I'll just say one thing. Go green!
Thank you so much, Professor Ken. Thank you.
Okay, take care.
You too. Bye-bye.
Okay, bye.
Bye.